So there's a Reddit thread where a lot of fire in a bottle topics are talked about at r/saturated fat. There were some discussions that popped up in the last week, essentially asking what is the point of all of these things that I talk about on this channel. I like to get down to the weeds sometimes. We get into reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria and gene regulation and gene expression and blah, 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 blah. And it's easy to miss the forest for the trees, as they say. And so I wanted to sort of do a zoom out for a second and kind of talk about where my head is at with all of this. What's the goal of the channel and these things that we're thinking about, etc. And so I responded to that thread, and I said that if you have a healthy human metabolism, you should be able to burn blood glucose. You should be able to burn starch from your food. You should also be able to burn saturated fat. Saturated fat is a normal human food of lots of cultures, as I like to point out, such as the historical French diet, where they consume a lot of butter, which is something like 70 to 80% saturated. And a healthy human metabolism can probably burn protein efficiently, right? A healthy metabolism can burn all three of those macronutrients efficiently. Obese humans, on the other hand, burn starch poorly compared to lean humans. The body fat of obese humans is composed of unsaturated fats. So we burn saturated fats cleanly, but we have to burn, if we want to lose weight, become lean, become metabolically flexible, and become metabolically healthy, we have to burn off our stored fat, which is mostly composed of unsaturated fats, which we don't burn so cleanly. And the last thing about obese humans, well, there's a lot of things, but one of the other things about obese humans is we have high levels of circulating branched chain amino acids. Amino acids make up proteins. Proteins are made up of about 20 different amino acids, and 3 of those are the branched chain amino acids. Obese humans have a problem breaking down those branched chain amino acids, and that leads to insulin resistance in skeletal muscle. I also pointed out in that existing diets all have the same problems. So calorie restriction, the ketogenic diet, fasting, and interestingly, the Mediterranean diet, which focuses on monounsaturated fat, all have one thing in common, that they reduce insulin signaling. And I talk in my video, olive oil makes you acutely insulin resistant. Insulin opposes the effects of PPAR alpha. When you consume oleic acid, monounsaturated fat, it makes something called OEA, which directly activates PPAR alpha. When insulin doesn't signal, you wind up with elevated free fatty acids, and the free fatty acids themselves, especially oleic acid, also activate PPAR alpha. And so all of these diets lead to activated PPAR alpha. And so the real question that I have is not, can we lose weight? I'm aware that it's possible to lose weight with keto. I've done it many times in my life. I'm aware that it's possible to lose weight with fasting. I'm even aware that it's possible to lose weight with calorie restriction if you do it long and hard enough. I've done all of these diets in my life and more. And with every single diet that I've ever done, of course, as soon as I stopped doing it, and the reason I stopped doing it is they're all hard to do. They're all hard to maintain. And as soon as you stop doing it, the weight comes right back on, right? None of these diets have shown that they can do anything to actually fix a broken human metabolism. And so the goal of this series is to actually understand obesity and to see if there's anything that we can do to quote unquote fix ourselves, which I define as being able to eat apple pie for breakfast and not worry about it. The apple pie for breakfast meme is, of course, tongue in cheek, but the reality is if you look at Americans from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, they ate pie all the time and it wasn't a problem. By and large, they were lean and they didn't have diabetes. This is one of my favorite papers. If you've followed along with the blog or the video series, you've probably seen these charts before. This is reversal of obesity and liver steatosis in mice via inhibition of ARAL hydrocarbon receptor and altered gene expression of cytochrome P450, 1B1, PPAR alpha, SCD1, and osteopontin. The AHR regulated downstream effectors of AHR obesity were shown to be CYP1B1, PPAR alpha target genes, SCD1, and osteopontin. Western diet caused an increase of CYP1B1, SCD1, and osteopontin and PPAR alpha target genes in the liver. And so all of the traditional diets are doing the same thing. And so these are mice fattened on a Western style diet. These down here are control mice on a high carb, low fat diet. These mice right here, they have the aryl hydrocarbon receptor blocked, and that lowers the expression of PPAR alpha target genes. And these mice that are on the Western diet immediately have obesity reversed, and they go back to presumably having something like a healthy metabolism. On the other hand, these are mice that are on a Western style diet and they become obese compared to the mice on a control high carb, low fat diet. And at this point where you see the red line begins, those mice were switched from the Western style diet onto the high carb, low fat diet. And you can see that they're not fixed. They don't continue to gain weight in the way that the mice on the quote unquote Western style diet do, but they also don't revert to the lean phenotype like you saw with when you block the aryl hydrocarbon receptor and when you get rid of the PPAR alpha signaling. And so I suspect that many of us, including myself, are here, right? We're doing what we can, and it's probably prevented us from further weight gain. We're probably down a bunch of pounds from our peak weight, but we're yet still not at our target weight, and we still struggle to lose the weight. And the question is why? What are the metabolic reasons that are keeping us stuck on the red line and not being on the green line? And so I talked about the mice on the high carb, low fat diets. And this is an interesting approach because it's the only diet that I can think of that does not increase PPAR alpha signaling. And PPAR alpha signaling leads to a bunch of problems such as upregulated SCD1, as you saw in that abstract, and also D6D, which is the thing that converts linoleic acid to what they call OXLAMs, oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. And those oxidized polyunsaturated fats cause all kinds of havoc with your metabolism. High carb, low fat diets reduce free fatty acids. When you reduce circulating free fatty acids, this increases insulin sensitivity. If you watch my video, The Redox Case for Carbs, I made a 10-minute version of it. You can see that a high carb, low fat diet increases NAD plus by activating something called pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, which creates reactive oxygen species, which helps to oxidize NAD plus. And high carb, low fat diets lead to high metabolic rates in humans. They lead to saturated body fat in humans. And some examples of this are Thai rice farmers who eat something like 84% of their macros are carbohydrates. They have the highest metabolic rates I've ever seen measured. These are resting metabolic rates when they're just sitting at rest doing nothing. There's also the Tsimane forager farmers who are in Brazil, and I believe they eat a lot of plantain and manioc, which are both, of course, starchy crops. And then I also have the Mayans. There's an interesting story in the literature from the 1930s. People noticed that Americans in the South had lower metabolic rates than those in the North. They thought that it was because people in warmer climates didn't need to have as high metabolic rates. They sent someone to Mexico and they studied native Mayans who presumably were eating corn and beans and sweet potatoes. Fun fact, sweet potatoes were domesticated in Mexico. And what they found was that the Mayans had higher metabolic rates than Americans in the North by about 5 to 10%. These are two articles on my blog, The Body Fat Saturation of Starch Eaters and Pontzer's Burn and Metabolic Rate Mechanisms, if you want to read up on starch and how that affects metabolic rate. My goal, by the way, in thinking about these high carb, low fat diets is not to need to remain on a high carb, low fat diet forever. The idea is, how do we reset? How do we burn the unsaturated fat that we have? How do we get to where we want to be? And then how can we continue to manipulate our metabolisms to our advantage going forward once we've attained that, so that we can eat apple pie for breakfast, or so that we don't have to be so strict all of the time and so concerned. And so the other question that's come up on our saturated fat is, how do we use the supplements that I talk about? And so first I want to start with stearic acid signaling. This, you can see, is a paper from 1967. And what they say is the relationship of body weight and adipose fatty acid composition has not been evaluated previously. Significant negative correlations occurred between the proportion of myristic and stearic acids and the proportion of standard body weight. So even back in 1967, it was known that the less stearic acid you had, the fatter you were, or conversely, the fatter you were, the less stearic acid that you had. This table is just most of the studies that have been done to that point on body fat composition. And 18.0, this is the stearic acid column. And if you take just a very rough average, if you just average the number found in each study, that number comes out to about 4.8%. This is a more recent study. This is also a meta-analysis. These little dots here are the results of individual studies and what they reported as normal stearic acid levels. And you can see the vast majority of them are below 4%. On average, these studies were mostly done after 1990. And you can see that the post-1990 average composition of stearic acid is 3.4%. So that's a decline of around 30%. Oh, look, you can see me. I'm still working out the technology. And so what this paper is showing, what is that? That's fenofibrate. And so fenofibrate is something that activates PPAR alpha. And you can see that in these mice, that are given PPAR alpha, it's reducing stearoyl ethanolamide. And what is that? So you can see here, this is a cell membrane, and these cell membranes have phosphatidoethanolamines. And this ethanolamine is just this little molecule that's stuck on the end. And of course, these fatty tails on the membranes are made out of fats, and those fats are there based on our body fat composition. You can see here in the membrane, we have these enzymes that use these fats that make up our cell membranes to make these signaling molecules called ethanolamides. This is a study in mice showing that the amount of stearoyl ethanolamide that's produced and that's in our blood is correlated to the amount of stearic acid in our adipose tissues. And so stearoyl ethanolamide is a signaling molecule, and presumably it has declined over time, because as the levels of stearic acid in our body fat have declined, stearoyl ethanolamide levels have declined as well. This is from a mouse study, and they gave stearoyl ethanolamide to mice, and you can see this is the level of SCD1 in their livers, which is one of the things that was reduced in that study where they reversed obesity, I should say. The stearoyl ethanolamide reduced SCD1 levels by about 75%. This one is really important. I believe this one is in rats, and you can see they put rats on a sort of a Western style high fat diet, and the amount of tissue necrosis factor alpha increased about threefold or 3 to 4-fold versus mice on a normal high carb, low fat diet. And when they gave them stearoyl ethanolamide, the levels of TNF alpha went right back to baseline. And I talked recently about how high levels of TNF alpha cause fat cells to inappropriately increase free fatty acids. And if you have elevated free fatty acids, that leads to insulin resistance. And as you can see, I do sell stearoyl ethanolamide at fireinaBottle.net/shop. I do believe that lack of stearic acid signaling is one of the primary problems of our modern metabolic malaise. The Natambi group in particular has done amazing work of demonstrating the problems that happens when the enzyme SCD1 is elevated and you convert all of your stearic acid to oleic acid, monounsaturated fat. This is a huge problem. This supplement is designed at reversing that. I've been taking a single tablet of that's 600 milligrams in the morning. For me, that's enough. The expectations of stearoyl ethanolamide are elevated body temperature, because you are able to more efficiently burn glucose, presumably, and in the long term, that elevated NAD plus levels from the burning of glucose will help you burn more fat. One of the other things I have is stearic acid as a supplement. A lot of people will put this into smoothies. Another thing you can do is you can just add it, like if you're sauteing some butter, you can add a pinch of stearic acid to that, and that will increase, obviously, the stearic acid content of the meal. This is well, it's not a recent paper, but it's a paper that I just found. And what they showed was in these mice, they gave them essentially a fat-free diet, but then in one of them, they gave them pure stearic acid, triolein. So this is essentially what I sell at fireinabottle.net/shop under food-grade stearic acid, or they fed them oleic acid, which is pure monounsaturated fat. And what they saw is that these are just wild-type mice given stearic acid. They ate 50% more food, so they were consuming 50% more calories, yet their body weight was 10% less than mice eating oleic acid. And you can see their fat mass is probably 40% less than the mice fed the oleic acid. And if you normalize this per body weight, the difference is even more dramatic. This is from that same paper. And what you can see is that the mice fed the oleic acid were also glucose resistant or insulin resistant. And you can see these white little droplets in the liver. Those are fat droplets. And so the stearic acid fed mice are free of fat droplets. They're insulin sensitive. The oleic acid fed mice are insulin resistant, and their liver is full of fat. And so that is one reason why I think probably if you are struggling with your metabolism, you want to avoid oleic acid as much as possible and try to stick with saturated fats and specifically stearic acid when possible. And so that's stearic acid signaling. The other thing, like I say, is that sterculia oil will help you prevent converting more of that stearic acid to oleic acid in your body tissues. And that brings us to oxidants. Now, remember that you can't burn fuel without oxygen. And the way that the mitochondria works is the oxygen doesn't interact directly with the fuels. You break your foods, whether it's carbohydrates or fat, into acetyl-CoA, and that acetyl-CoA gets oxidized by NAD+. And the NAD+ takes those electrons from your food up to the electron transport chain, and the electron transport chain returns those electrons to oxygen. So you can't burn food without oxygen. You can't burn calories without oxygen. But really, when we say oxygen in the context of a mitochondria, what we mean is NAD+. NAD+ is the oxidant that actually you use to burn those calories. And so I'm going to talk about four. The first one is RALA. Alpha lipoic acid is what ALA stands for. Pyruvate, succinate, and AKG. I don't sell RALA or pyruvate. I do sell succinate and AKG at fireinabottle.net/shop. And so this is RALA. Now, there's a product on the market that's just called ALA, or alpha lipoic acid. I was recommending that at first, but what I found is if I took very much of that, I would start to get sleepy. I had fatigue problems from it. And what I found is that the RALA, I don't have those same problems. The RALA seems to be very mitochondrial specific, where the ALA has the same effect in both the cytoplasm of the cell and in the mitochondria. I don't know why that makes such a big difference, but that's been my personal experience, and I've heard a lot of other anecdotal reports of the same thing. So what happens is when you consume this, RALA is basically like a fat. And it has these two sulfur atoms that are connected together. And so we make and use RALA in our mitochondria. And so there's a system that seems to import the RALA effectively, break it down, and excrete it effectively. But what it does in the meantime is it gets imported into the mitochondria, and it's a little hard to read here, but this, instead of being two sulfur atoms connected to each other, is an SH and an SH. And where does that H come from? It comes from the NADH, and this gives you back NAD+. So this is essentially injecting oxygen into your mitochondria to allow you to burn calories. And it's doing that by giving these electrons to the alpha lipoic acid itself. And so this just directly increases NAD+. This is a super interesting paper in mice. They actually made mice obese in a bunch of different ways, and they gave them ALA, and in every case, the ALA reverses the obesity. And as they increase the dose of ALA, you see the NAD+, or just the NAD to NADH ratio, increases dramatically with ALA. That activates SIRT1. SIRT1 activates something called AMP kinase. AMP kinase increases your ability to burn fat. AMP kinase increases your ability to burn glucose. It basically just increases your metabolic rate, generally speaking. So that's in mice, obviously. Does this translate to humans? Well, it does. You can see these are women who are all put on a low-calorie diet. The control diet, or this one supplemented with fish oil, they lost 5.2 kilograms or 5.4 kilograms. But if you gave them alpha lipoic acid instead of the fish oil, they lost 7 kilograms. And there's been meta-analyses that show that, in fact, ALA increases weight loss. On its own, it hasn't entirely fixed humans. But on the other hand, in all of these studies, people are still eating polyunsaturated fats. They're still eating olive oil and other monounsaturated fats. And so the question is, which of these techniques can we combine, right? We see all of these techniques that have some effect in humans. You know, a difference between humans and mouse studies is that the metabolic rates of mice are something like 12 times as fast, sort of per kilogram, as that of humans. And so you can give something to a mouse and you see this very fast, immediate result, and you give it to a human and you can see a result in the same direction. So pyruvate works sort of similarly to ALA, except it is in the cytoplasm. So pyruvate just comes from glucose, and when you do glycolysis, you take glucose in your cells and you break that glucose down to pyruvate, and pyruvate's actually what enters the mitochondria. And pyruvate can be converted to lactate by giving it some electrons. And so there's this thing called lactate dehydrogenase, and what it does, it actually can go both ways. If you consume a lot of lactate, it will make a lot of NADH and it'll make pyruvate. But if you give your cells a lot of pyruvate, they'll turn a lot of NADH into NAD+, and they'll make some lactate. And that's good. That will give you a boost, especially perhaps before a meal. Pyruvate will drive down those... We'll drive down that NADH in the cytoplasm. Again, that's where SIRT1 lives. So if you can take some pyruvate with that RALA, now you're sending oxidants towards both the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. Pyruvate is another one that has been studied in humans for weight loss, and it says 9 trials were identified and 6 were included. All had methodological weaknesses. The meta-analysis revealed a statistically significant difference in body weight with pyruvate compared to placebo. So again, pyruvate on its own has not been shown to be a panacea, as it were. But again, I think we need to think about combining some of these approaches. That brings us to succinate. You can check out obesity as a global succinate dehydrogenase activity deficit on Fire in a Bottle. Succinate is very interesting. You can see this is the citric acid cycle here. Most electrons enter the electron transport chain, which is how we make ATP, via NADH at complex 1. However, succinate inputs its electrons at complex 2, and when that happens, all of the electrons from complex 1 and complex 2 have to get through this thing called coenzyme Q, and that makes a bottleneck. And so when succinate goes through complex 2, it causes a bunch of these electrons to move back through complex 1 and create reactive oxygen species. And reactive oxygen species You can watch my video, The ROS Theory of Obesity. The end result of producing ROS at complex 2 is it oxidizes the NAD pool and it converts a bunch of NADH to NAD+. These mice were given succinate in their drinking water, and you can see this UCP1, this is uncoupling protein. This causes increased energy expenditure. It increased it by almost 50-fold, and PGC1A is another super important thing that causes you to burn energy, and that was increased by about 3-fold by mice consuming succinate. These are the mice given succinate in their drinking water. This sort of purpley blue line is the succinate group, and that's their metabolic rate over a 24-hour period. So you can see they have a consistently elevated metabolic rate because they're consuming succinate compared to the controls, because they keep that NAD+ pool oxidized. This is the body weights of mice given succinate, and so you can see this is 1% of their calories as succinate. The 1% is this kind of purpley line, and the 1.5% is the more blue line. And you can see the ones with 1.5% of calories as succinate really lose weight, but even the ones with only 1% have increased lean mass and reduced fat mass. This is a second experiment. These guys were given 2% of succinate as calories, and you can see the weight loss is dramatic. And over here, you can see the increased lean mass and the reduced fat mass as a result of the succinate supplementation. Succinate also increased the muscle grip strength of the mice. Muscle grip strength is a great indicator of overall body strength. So with that increased lean mass, you're seeing increased strength. The mice given succinate also increase the amount of succinate dehydrogenase that they have. This is great because you can see that obese humans have low succinate dehydrogenase activity. Succinate dehydrogenase is also known as complex 2. And so one of my concerns about succinate is if you don't have complex 2 activity like in most obese humans, will you be able to fully utilize it at first? And that's why I've always suggested combining succinate with things like alpha lipoic acid, with things like pyruvate. That will hopefully get your complex 2 deacetylated, which is what happens when you activate SIRT1 and get that working again. The other thing I sell is alphaketoglutarate. What is that? Obese humans have elevated levels of branched chain amino acids. You can see here's the obese humans, here's the lean humans, and valine, leucine, and isoleucine. As I said near the beginning, those tend to rise in obesity, and this is in humans again. And this is alphaketoglutarate is actually low in obese humans compared to lean humans. The reason this alphaketoglutarate is interesting is you can see this is the 3 branched chain amino acids, and the first step in breaking them down actually requires alpha-ketoglutarate. Then there's another step that happens. Once you have enough alpha-ketoglutarate to break it down, there's another step that actually requires NAD+. And that step is called branched chain alpha-keto acid dehydrogenase, is the enzyme that catalyzes that. And this enzyme, much like pyruvate dehydrogenase, actually creates ROS as it works. And so if you have a buildup of these branched chain amino acids, you are going to have a buildup of NAD+, because you're not going to be able to generate ROS through this branched chain alpha-keto acid dehydrogenase. To compound this even further, valine and isoleucine get converted into succinyl-CoA, which, guess what? That is succinate. And just to show this all in theory working in mice, and again, some of these we don't have human examples of, some of these have only been tried in mice, and so so we as a community can think about these issues and give them a shot. But here's the normal mice. You can see like valine is 184. If you put them on the high-fat Western diet, it goes up to 233, and if you give them alpha-ketoglutarate, it goes back down to 181. And then here's their insulin sensitivity. And in this case, a lower number means you're more insulin sensitive, which is good. So the normal mice are at 1,000. The high-fat mice, it goes up to 1,400. And again, if you give them the alpha-ketoglutarate and you bring those branched-chain amino acids down, insulin sensitivity goes back to baseline. And if you look at, they looked at different fat tissues. So I think this is epididymal fat was 18 or 19. In the high-fat diet, it goes up to 30. And then with the alpha-ketoglutarate, it goes back down to 18. How much of these supplements should we take? When should we be taking them? Before meals, I think makes a lot of sense. That 2% of the mouse calories as they were given as disodium succinate. If you're on a 3,000 calorie diet, that would be 60 calories a day. The succinate is 800 milligrams a capsule. If you assume that disodium succinate is about 4 calories per gram, that would be 15 grams of succinate, which is around 20 capsules a day, which is admittedly a lot. And I certainly wouldn't go past that. I have not consumed that much. It's something interesting to think about. I've usually will take 6 capsules one time per day, or perhaps 2 times a day. The RALA, I've been taking 240 milligrams in the morning, and often another 240 milligrams in the afternoon. That's another one that I am considering increasing the dosage of. I shied away from it because I initially had the issues with ALA and fatigue, but that has not been a problem with the RALA. The alpha-ketoglutarate is 500 milligrams per capsule. I've been taking 2,000 milligrams in the morning and often another 2,000 milligrams in the afternoon. Healthy humans should be able to burn glucose, saturated fat, and protein. One of the things that's changed in healthy humans is we have less stearic acid than we used to. This is presumably because we ate too many vegetable oils over the years. That resulted in increased SCD1 levels. That resulted in oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, which activated the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, which activated PPAR alpha, and led to downstream increases in enzymes such as SCD1 and D6D. When we look for the head of the snake, to me, it looks like steroyl ethanolamide. It looks like signaling from our adipose tissue to the rest of the body to tell it, are we in fat storing mode, or is it summer and we're in lean fat burning mode? And that steroyl ethanolamide acts by reducing levels of SCD1 in the liver, and it acts by reducing levels of tissue necrosis factor alpha. If we can reduce the levels of tissue necrosis factor alpha, that means we have less free fatty acids in our bloodstream. If we have less free fatty acids, that allows us to burn more glucose. Once we start burning glucose, again, if you watch my video, the redox case for carbs, the glucose itself helps us to start to oxidize that NAD pool and convert that NADH to NAD+. But there are, of course, a bunch of things we can do to help oxidize that NADH pool, including pyruvate, including RALA, including disodium succinate, and including AKG. The branched-chain amino acids are a really interesting part of all of this, and protein in general. I've talked about studies in the past showing that protein restriction, certainly in mice, can have huge effects on weight loss or beneficial effects on weight loss. There are studies in humans showing the same thing. I tried a low protein diet recently. I didn't get big success off of it. At the time, I was combining it with, I was using mostly coconut oil. So going forward, I'm going to be experimenting with low carb. I'm also might experiment some more with low protein, but I'm certainly going to continue the AKG because it seems to me like that's a huge tool that helps us to break down those circulating branched chain amino acids, but that also is thermogenic. It allows us to burn those BCAAs. Those BCAAs are incredibly thermogenic when burned due to branched chain keto acid dehydrogenase. Okay, so that pretty much paints my theory around all of this, at least where I am at right now. There's, of course, more to it. We'll think in the future about, we can talk about cortisol, we can talk about leptin, there's any number of other things, but those to me look like core kind of conduit. for how we can start to perhaps change over our broken metabolisms and start to slowly work on fixing them going forward. I hope you guys are having a great week. I'm excited that fall is here and I'm back into more of a routine, and we will keep working on it.